Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In the spring of 1949, if you had your radio dial tuned to just about any station in America, you would have heard a sound. It was a sound as sweet and comforting as a whispered promise, a voice that seemed to float out of the speaker, wrapped in the gentle sigh of a steel guitar. The song was called Candy Kisses, and the voice belonged to a handsome young man from Tennessee named George Morgan. For a moment in time, that voice was everywhere. It wasn't just a country hit, it was an American phenomenon, a soothing balm for a nation still shaking off the long shadow of war, a sound that promised simple romance and heartfelt devotion. George Morgan, with his impossibly smooth baritone and boy-next-door charm, became an overnight sensation, a pillar of the Grand Ole Opry, and the man they called the Candy Kid. He was, for all intents and purposes, a superstar. His records sold in the millions, his face adorned the covers of magazines, and his spot on the Opry stage was sacred, a position he held with grace and dignity for nearly 3 decades. He was a constant, a comforting presence in a world of music that was about to be turned completely upside down. And then, almost as quietly as his voice entered the national consciousness, it began to fade from it. The world changed, the music changed, and the man with the candy-coated voice found himself standing still as the parade of popular culture marched right on past him. This isn't just the story of a forgotten hit song. It's the story of a man who achieved the pinnacle of fame only to live out his life in its long, bittersweet shadow. It's the story of a quiet craftsman in an industry that was beginning to reward rebellion, a devoted father whose greatest legacy would be the daughter who would carry his name back into the spotlight, and a gentle heart that, in the end, simply gave out too soon. This is the story of the quiet, dignified tragedy of George Morgan, the voice that a generation of country music fans fell in love with, and the voice that, for the most part, country music history forgot. How does a man who was once the king of the airwaves become a ghost in the machine? The answer is a tale of shifting tastes, quiet dignity, and a love for a single institution that would define his entire life. To truly understand George Morgan, you have to place yourself in the America of the late 1940s. It was a nation holding its breath, caught in the strange, quiet exhale after the thunderous roar of the Second World War. The GIs were home, but they were changed, carrying silent burdens and a deep, unspoken yearning for normalcy. The country was collectively trying to remember how to live in peace, how to dream simple dreams again. Suburbs were blooming across the landscape, rows of identical houses promising a safe, predictable future. The air was thick with a cautious optimism, a desire to believe in straightforward things, a steady job, a family, a home, and true love. It was a world that had had its fill of chaos and complexity. It was a world craving sweetness, and the music of the era reflected that craving. The big bands that had provided the soundtrack to the war years were beginning to sound a little too loud, a little too frantic for this new, quieter mood. In their place, a generation of smooth, comforting solo vocalists rose to prominence. Singers like Perry Como, Bing Crosby, and a young Frank Sinatra were the kings of the pop charts, their effortless baritones offering a sense of sophisticated calm. They sang of love in its most idealized form, moonlit nights, tender moments, and unwavering devotion. This was the dominant sound of mainstream America, a sonic landscape of polished, string-laden romance. But down south, another sound was bubbling up, a sound that was, in many ways, the polar opposite of that polished pop. This was the raw, untamed world of country music, or hillbilly music, as it was still often called. It was the music of the working man, broadcast from the sacred stage of the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee, the home of the Grand Ole Opry. The Opry of the 1940s was a glorious, chaotic tapestry of American roots music. You had the high, lonesome wail of Roy Acuff, the king of country music, whose voice seemed to carry the sorrows of the Appalachian hills. You had the raucous proto-rockabilly energy of string bands like Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, playing music at a breakneck speed that was anything but calm. And you had the rough-hewn, tear-in-your-beer sound of honky tonk, championed by men like Ernest Tubb, whose songs were gritty tales of barrooms, cheating hearts, and the hard realities of life. This was music with bark on it, music that was unapologetically rural, raw, and real. It was into this divided musical world that George Morgan was born, a world of polished pop crooners on one side and gritty country storytellers on the other. He was a product of both, and yet belonged fully to neither. He was born in Waverly, Tennessee, in 1924, in the heart of country music's homeland. But his family, like so many others, during the Great Depression, moved north in search of work, settling in the industrial tire town of Barberton, Ohio. This geographical shift is crucial to understanding him. George grew up a Southerner in the North, a boy with Tennessee roots, living in a blue-collar Ohio world. He was a living embodiment of the Great Migration that was changing the cultural fabric of America. He fell in love with the music he heard crackling over the radio waves, a mix of everything the nation was listening to. He absorbed the heartfelt stories of the country singers he idolized, like Gene Autry, the singing cowboy. But he also heard the smooth, sophisticated phrasing of the pop crooners. He was a musical sponge, soaking it all in. When he picked up a guitar and began to sing, what came out was something unique. It was a sound that had the heartfelt sincerity of his country heroes, but it was delivered with the smooth, velvety texture of a pop balladeer. He didn't have the nasal twang of many of his contemporaries, nor the rough-edged delivery of the honky-tonk singers. His voice was a gentle, rounded baritone, a sound built for expressing tenderness, not turmoil. In a world that seemed to demand that artists pick a side, either the polished sophistication of pop or the raw authenticity of country, George Morgan was quietly forging a third path. He was a country singer who sounded like a crooner, a balladeer with a touch of Tennessee in his soul. It was a sound that shouldn't have worked. The country purists might have found it too slick, too sentimental, while the pop world might have dismissed it as too hillbilly. But George Morgan was about to prove that he had created a sound that was perfectly, miraculously in tune with the quiet, romantic yearnings of post-war America. He was a man out of place who found himself, by a stroke of genius or a twist of fate, in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. He was about to offer the country a different kind of country music, one that traded tales of the barroom for whispers in the parlor, a sound that was less about Saturday night sinning and more about Sunday morning devotion. George Morgan's journey from a shared bedroom in a working-class Ohio home to the hallowed stage of the Ryman Auditorium was not a story of sudden, explosive discovery. It was a slow, methodical climb built on a foundation of unwavering self-belief and a quiet, almost stubborn persistence. After high school, he took a job at a local munitions plant, a typical path for a young man in Barberton during the war years. But his nights were filled with music. He played in local clubs and cafes, his smooth voice and handsome, unassuming presence winning over the crowds. His real ambition, however, lay in the magical world of radio, the gateway to a bigger audience and a life beyond the factory floor. He began his radio career at a small station in Akron, Ohio, but his sights were set much higher. He knew, with an instinct that would guide his entire career, that if he wanted to make it in country music, he had to go to the source. He had to go to Nashville. He packed his bags and headed south to the one station that mattered above all others, WSM, the 50,000-watt Clear Channel home of the Grand Ole Opry. The Nashville of the 1940s was not yet the slick corporate music city it would become. It was a tight-knit, insular community, and breaking in was notoriously difficult. George auditioned for WSM and was promptly rejected. It was a crushing blow, but not a fatal one. He took a job at a rival station, WLAC, and continued to hone his craft, building a local following with his daily morning show. He was biding his time, waiting for another chance. That chance came in 1948, not through a formal audition, but through the back door, thanks to a fellow performer who believed in him. The legendary comedian and Opry star Minnie Pearl heard Morgan sing and was immediately captivated. She saw past the polished delivery to the genuine heart beneath and became his champion. She relentlessly advocated for him to the Opry's management, and with her crucial endorsement, powerful WSM executive Harry Stone gave George Morgan his spot on the Grand Ole Opry. This is a pivotal and often misunderstood part of his story. George Morgan became a member of the Grand Ole Opry in September 1948, before he had a hit record. This was an almost unheard of occurrence. In those days, an Opry slot was the reward for proven success, the crowning achievement for a career built on hit songs and sold-out shows. Morgan's induction was a testament to the raw, undeniable appeal of his voice and his persona. The Opry management saw in him the future, a new kind of country star, one who could appeal not just to the traditional rural audience, but to a broader, more modern demographic. They were betting on his potential, and it was a bet that was about to pay off in a way no one could have imagined. Almost immediately after joining the Opry, he was signed to a contract with Columbia Records, one of the biggest labels in the country. He went into the studio for his first recording session, and one of the songs he brought with him was a simple, heartfelt ballad he had written himself. The story of its creation has become a piece of Nashville folklore. He was driving to a gig one night, his mind on a woman he was courting, when the words and melody began to form in his head. Having no paper, the story, now a piece of Nashville folklore, is that having no paper, he scribbled the lyrics on the back of a brown paper bag. The song was a declaration of love in its purest, most innocent form, a string of sweet nothings and declarations of devotion. He called it Candy Kisses. When Columbia released Candy Kisses in early 1949, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The song was a runaway smash. It rocketed to #1 on the country charts and stayed there for 3 weeks. But its success didn't stop there. In an era when the pop and country charts were two entirely separate universes, Candy Kisses crossed over, becoming a massive mainstream hit. It was a cultural phenomenon. At one point, multiple versions of the song, George's original, and cover versions by pop singers like Tony Martin and Danny Kaye, were all flooding the pop charts, with several becoming major hits. George Morgan, the boy from Barberton, was suddenly one of the biggest recording artists in America. He was no longer just a promising new Opry member, he was the Candy Kid, a national star. The success of Candy Kisses was followed by a torrent of hits that solidified his place as a leading figure in country music. Songs like Please Don't Let Me Love You, Room Full of Roses, and Cry Baby Heart all followed a similar successful formula. They were romantic, melodic ballads, often featuring the weeping sound of a steel guitar, and increasingly, the lush backing of string sections. This was a significant departure from the raw fiddle and guitar sound of traditional country music. George Morgan, along with another smooth-voiced pioneer named Eddie Arnold, was at the forefront of a new movement, creating a more polished, sophisticated sound that would lay the groundwork for the Nashville sound of the late 1950s and 60s. He was smoothing the rough edges of country music, making it more palatable to a mainstream audience, and becoming incredibly successful in the process. Throughout the early 1950s, George Morgan was at the absolute zenith of his career. He was a constant presence on the charts, a sought-after live performer, and most importantly to him, a beloved star of the Grand Ole Opry. He didn't just perform on the Opry, he became one of its most reliable and gracious hosts. His calm, professional demeanor, a steadying presence amidst the show's often chaotic energy. He was the handsome, smiling face of a gentler, more romantic kind of country music. But as the 1950s wore on, the cultural ground began to shift beneath his feet. A new sound was exploding out of Memphis, a raw, rebellious, and sexually charged fusion of country and rhythm and blues. It was called rock and roll, and its king was a sneering young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, named Elvis Presley. The arrival of Elvis was a cataclysmic event in American popular music. Suddenly, the gentle romance of singers like George Morgan felt quaint, old-fashioned. The teenagers who now controlled the record-buying market didn't want sweet devotion. They wanted raw energy, rebellion, and danger. The charts, which had once been filled with crooners, were now dominated by hip-shaking rock and rollers. For George Morgan, this shift was devastating. His record sales, which had once been astronomical, began to decline sharply by 1953. His incredible streak of top 10 hits had come to an end. While he would continue to chart sporadically throughout the 1960s, the days of number one records were over. Columbia Records, the label he had helped build into a country music powerhouse, began to pressure him to adapt, to record more up-tempo, rock-influenced material. He tried, but his heart was never in it. His voice, so perfectly suited to tender ballads, sounded awkward and forced on novelty songs. He was a man out of time, a romantic balladeer in an age of electric guitars and screaming fans. As his recording career waned, he retreated ever more deeply into the one place he still felt truly at home, the Grand Ole Opry. Here, his status was secure. He was no longer a chart topper, but he was a legend, an elder statesman. He was a living link to a bygone era, and the Opry audiences, who were often older and more traditional, still loved him for it. He settled into this new role with a quiet grace. There was no public bitterness, no desperate attempt to chase trends. He was George Morgan, the man who sang Candy Kisses, and he embraced that identity with a sense of dignified acceptance. Perhaps the most significant and emotionally resonant event of his later career occurred on that sacred stage in 1973. By this time, his daughter, a talented young singer named Lorrie, was beginning to follow in his footsteps. George arranged for her to make her debut on the Grand Ole Opry at the tender age of 13. He brought her out onto the stage of the Ryman, the same stage where he had made his own dreams come true, and proudly introduced her to the world. She sang a version of the classic country song Paper Roses. It was a powerful, poignant moment, a passing of the torch. For George, it must have been a complex mix of emotions, immense pride in his daughter's talent, and perhaps a bittersweet acknowledgement that his own time in the spotlight was giving way to a new generation. He spent the final years of his life as a beloved fixture of the Opry family. In 1974, he was there for the historic opening of the new Grand Ole Opry House, a moment that symbolized the modernization of the institution he loved. He continued to record, releasing his final album in 1975, but his health was beginning to fail. He had a history of heart problems, and in the summer of 1975, he underwent open heart surgery. It was a risky procedure, and initially it seemed to be a success. But just a few days later, on July 7, 1975, George Morgan suffered a massive post-operative heart attack and died. He was only 51 years old. The man with the gentle voice, the steady presence, who had been a part of the Opry family for 27 years, was gone. The Candy Kid had sung his final song. Behind the warm smile and the velvet smooth voice, George Morgan was a man of quiet complexities, a deeply private individual whose life off stage was defined by a fierce devotion to two things: his family and the Grand Ole Opry. The public saw the polished, handsome balladeer, the picture of romantic sincerity. But to understand the heart of the man, you have to look past the footlights and into the calmer, more intimate spaces of his life. His marriage to Anastasia Anna Paradon was the bedrock of his existence. In a business notorious for its broken homes and scandalous affairs, especially during the tumultuous era of hard-drinking, honky-tonk stars, George's home life was a bastion of stability. He was, by all accounts, a dedicated husband and father. Anna was not a figure from the country music world. She was a girl from his hometown of Barberton, and their bond was forged long before the glare of fame. This connection to his pre-stardom life kept him grounded. While other stars were carousing at Tootsie's Orchid Lounge after an Opry show, George was more likely to be heading home. He was a man who seemed to have little taste for the wilder side of the music business, preferring the quiet comfort of his family to the raucous camaraderie of the road. This domesticity was both a personal choice and perhaps a professional one. His entire musical persona was built on sincerity and steadfastness. Living a life that contradicted that image would have been a betrayal of the very essence of his art. The true emotional core of his later life, however, was his relationship with his daughter, Lorrie. From the moment she was born, he saw in her a reflection of his own passion for music, and he nurtured it with a gentle guiding hand. Lorrie Morgan, who would go on to become one of the biggest female country stars of the 1980s and 90s, has spoken and written at length about her father, painting a portrait of a man who was both her hero and her most dedicated teacher. He wasn't a domineering stage father pushing his child into a life she didn't want. Instead, he was a supportive mentor who recognized her prodigious talent and gave her the tools to succeed. In her autobiography, Forever Yours Faithfully, Lorrie recounts countless intimate moments that reveal the depth of their bond. She recalls sitting at his feet as a small child, watching him write songs, his brow furrowed in concentration. He taught her how to phrase a lyric, how to connect with an audience not just with her voice, but with her eyes. He would tell her, "Sing it like you mean it, honey. If you don't believe what you're singing, nobody else will either." It was the core principle of his own career, a lesson in authenticity that she would carry with her throughout her own. He wasn't just teaching her technique, he was imparting a philosophy. One of the most poignant and revealing anecdotes she shares is about his quiet struggle as his fame began to wane. She was old enough to see the change, to notice that the phone didn't ring as often, that the crowds for his solo shows were smaller. She remembers him sitting quietly in his study, listening to the new sounds on the radio, a thoughtful, perhaps melancholy expression on his face. He never voiced any bitterness to her, never complained about the changing times. Instead, he maintained a quiet dignity that was in itself a powerful lesson. He taught her that fame was fleeting, but respect and professionalism were forever. He showed her that you could face disappointment not with anger, but with grace. He was modeling a way to survive in a notoriously fickle business, a lesson that would prove invaluable to her during the inevitable ups and downs of her own career. The moment he brought her onto the Opry stage for her debut, is the defining scene of their relationship. Imagine the weight of that moment for George. The Ryman Auditorium was his cathedral, the place that had given him everything. To stand on that sacred circle of wood, a spot where all his heroes had stood, and to present his own daughter to the world, it was the ultimate validation, the culmination of his life as both a father and an artist. Lorrie recalls being terrified, a trembling 13-year-old in a new dress. She remembers her father kneeling down beside her just before the curtain went up, taking her hand and saying, Don't you be scared. Just look out there and find one friendly face and sing right to them. I'll be right here." And he was. He stood in the wings, his face beaming with a pride that transcended any standing ovation he had ever received for himself. In that moment, he wasn't George Morgan, the former hitmaker. He was just Lorrie's dad, and it was the role he cherished most. Off stage, among his Opry peers, he was known as a true gentleman. In an environment filled with larger-than-life egos, he was a calm, steadying presence. He was famously well-read and articulate, a man who could discuss literature and world affairs as easily as he could talk about chord progressions. He had a dry, intelligent wit that was a stark contrast to the broad, cornpone humor of many of his contemporaries. Friends like Minnie Pearl and Chet Atkins spoke of him with a deep, abiding respect, not just for his talent, but for his character. He was a man of his word, a professional who always showed up on time, knew his lines, and treated everyone, from the biggest stars to the stagehands, with the same level of courtesy. Yet beneath this calm exterior, there must have been a quiet ache. To have tasted the absolute pinnacle of success, to have been the artist that everyone was talking about, and then to watch it all slowly slip away is a uniquely painful experience. It requires a profound strength of character to not let bitterness consume you. George Morgan found that strength in his family and in his unwavering loyalty to the Opry. The Opry became his refuge. While the outside world chased the latest fads, the Opry was a constant. On its stage, he was not a has-been. He was a legend. Every Saturday night when he stepped up to the WSM microphone and sang "Candy Kisses," the audience would erupt. For those 3 minutes, it was 1949 all over again. This weekly ritual was more than just a performance. It was a reaffirmation of his identity, a reminder of who he was and what he had accomplished. It was his anchor in a sea of change. The final chapter of his personal story is one of quiet courage in the face of his own mortality. In the mid-1970s, open-heart surgery was still a terrifying and uncertain gamble. He faced the decision with the same pragmatism and lack of drama that defined his life. He knew the risks, but he also knew it was his only chance to live to see his daughter's career truly blossom. The tragedy is that he was so close. He survived the operation itself, a testament to his strength, only to be struck down by a complication days later. His death was not the fiery rock and roll exit of a Hank Williams or a Patsy Cline. It was a quiet, clinical departure, a gentle fading away that was, in a way, heartbreakingly consistent with the man he was. He left the world not with a bang, but with a whisper, leaving behind a silence that would be felt most deeply by his family and by the Opry community that had been his home for nearly 30 years. The story of George Morgan is notably free of the kind of controversy that often fuels the legends of country music stars. There were no public scandals, no tales of drunken rampages, no messy divorces played out in the tabloids. His life was one of remarkable personal integrity. The debates that surround him, therefore, are not about character, but about music, identity, and the very definition of what it means to be country. The first and most significant debate began almost as soon as Candy Kisses hit the airwaves. Was George Morgan truly a country singer? To the purists of the day, the answer was a resounding no. Country music, in their eyes, was the raw, unvarnished sound of the rural South. It was supposed to have a certain twang, a certain grit. It was the music of fiddles and acoustic guitars, sung with a high, lonesome ache. George Morgan's music, by contrast, was smooth, polished, and romantic. His clear, resonant baritone had more in common with Bing Crosby than with Roy Acuff. He eschewed the nasal tones of traditional country singing for a more rounded, classically pop delivery. His songs weren't about drinking, cheating, or the hardships of farming life. They were sweet, sentimental ballads that could have just as easily been sung by a mainstream pop crooner. This debate placed him at the center of a cultural tug-of-war for the soul of country music. On one side were the traditionalists who saw his success and that of Eddie Arnold as a dangerous dilution of the genre. They feared that this new citified sound would erase the music's distinctive regional identity, smoothing over its rough edges until it was indistinguishable from the pop music that dominated the national charts. They saw him not as an innovator, but as an assimilationist, someone who was sanding down the very things that made country music special in order to sell records to a wider, non-country audience. For them, the introduction of lush string arrangements on his records was the ultimate betrayal, a surrender to the schmaltzy aesthetics of Tin Pan Alley. On the other side of the debate were the modernizers, including the visionary producers and executives who were beginning to build the Nashville music industry. They saw George Morgan as a crucial figure, a bridge between the insular world of hillbilly music and the vast, untapped mainstream market. They argued that for country music to survive and grow, it had to evolve. It had to appeal to listeners in cities and suburbs, not just in rural towns. They saw Morgan's smooth, accessible style as the key to unlocking that potential. He was, in their view, a pioneer, a man who proved that a country artist could achieve massive nationwide success without sacrificing their identity. This faction would ultimately win the argument, and George Morgan's crossover success became the blueprint for the Nashville sound, the dominant style of country music for the next 2 decades, which relied heavily on pop-influenced production, smooth vocals, and string sections. The debate, then, is whether George Morgan was a forerunner of a necessary evolution or the harbinger of a commercial compromise that cost the genre its soul. The second major area of debate is a more historical and tragic one, and it addresses the central theme of his life. Why has he been so thoroughly forgotten compared to his contemporaries? Hank Williams died 2 years before George Morgan was even 30, yet his myth has only grown over time, making him an almost sainted figure in American music. Johnny Cash, who came along just after Morgan's peak, became a global icon whose influence transcends genre. Even many lesser-known honky-tonk figures from the same era are more revered by country music aficionados and historians. George Morgan, who was arguably a bigger star than almost all of them in 1949, has been relegated to a historical footnote, a name known primarily to die-hard Opry fans and record collectors. One side of this debate argues that his music was simply too tied to its specific moment in time. The sweet, innocent sentimentality of Candy Kisses was the perfect antidote to the trauma of World War II, but it had a short shelf life. When the rebellious, complex energy of rock and roll and the cynical introspection of the 1960s counterculture arrived, Morgan's music suddenly sounded hopelessly naive and dated. Unlike the timeless, universal pain in a Hank Williams song or the mythic, rebellious grit of a Johnny Cash tune, George Morgan's gentle romanticism didn't translate as well to later generations. His music was a beautiful but fragile time capsule. Another, more compelling argument centers on his personality. The great enduring legends of music are often built on a foundation of tragedy, rebellion, and myth. Hank Williams was the tormented, alcoholic poet who died in the back of a Cadillac. Johnny Cash was the man in black, the outlaw who stared into the abyss. George Morgan, by contrast, was a nice, professional, happily married man who went to work, did his job beautifully, and went home to his family. He was stable, reliable, and decent. These are wonderful qualities for a human being, but they are poor ingredients for myth making. He didn't live the tortured life that history seems to demand of its musical icons. His quiet dignity and lack of public drama, the very things that made him so respected in his lifetime, have made him almost invisible to history. He was too good, too normal, to become a legend. The controversy, then, is a quiet one. In the grand narrative of popular music, does a good man with a gentle voice stand a chance against a tormented genius with a guitar? George Morgan's legacy suggests that, tragically, the answer is often no. He is a victim not of scandal, but of his own quiet grace. The death of George Morgan in 1975 sent a wave of quiet sorrow through Nashville, particularly within the walls of the Grand Ole Opry. For the Opry family, his passing was not just the loss of a fellow performer, it was the end of an era. He had been a constant presence on their stage for nearly 3 decades, a link back to the so-called golden age of the Ray Man. The Opry held a memorial service for him on its stage, a testament to his central place in the institution's heart. But outside of Nashville, the news of his death was met with a muted response. For the wider American public, he was a half-remembered name from a distant past, the man who sang that sweet song a long, long time ago. The world had moved on, and his quiet passing was a stark reflection of how far the spotlight had moved away from him. The most significant and enduring part of George Morgan's legacy is not a sound, but a person. His daughter, Lorrie Morgan. Her career is the second act of the Morgan family story, a direct and living continuation of his influence. Lorrie emerged as a major country star in the late 1980s, becoming one of the leading female voices of her generation. Her success was a fulfillment of the promise her father had seen in her on the Opry stage all those years ago. But her connection to him was more than just biographical. She was his student, and her music carried his lessons forward. Like her father, she possessed a voice that could convey deep emotion with a polished, accessible delivery. She wasn't a gritty traditionalist. She was a modern country pop star, a direct inheritor of the crossover-friendly path he had helped to blaze. Throughout her career, Lorrie has been the most passionate and effective curator of her father's memory. She didn't shy away from her lineage, she embraced it. She frequently spoke of him in interviews, sharing the stories and lessons he had imparted. She recorded duets with his original vocal tracks, using modern technology to create poignant, posthumous collaborations that introduced his voice to a new generation. Her 1998 album, My Heart, was a loving tribute, featuring her interpretations of some of his classic songs. For millions of her fans, their first introduction to the music of George Morgan came through the loving filter of his daughter. In a very real sense, Lorrie Morgan became her father's legacy, ensuring that the Morgan name would once again be associated with hit records and a prominent place in the country music landscape. His quiet fade from memory was, in a way, reversed by the sound of her own success. Musically, George Morgan's significance is more subtle but no less important. He was a crucial transitional figure in the history of country music. By proving that a smooth-voiced, ballad-oriented country singer could achieve massive mainstream success, he laid the commercial and aesthetic groundwork for the Nashville sound. The producers who would go on to define that sound in the late 50s and 60s, like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley, were paying close attention to the success of George Morgan and Eddie Arnold. They saw that there was a huge audience for a version of country music that was less country, one that replaced fiddles with string sections and raw twang with polished vocals. This led directly to the lush pop-inflected hits of artists like Patsy Cline, Jim Reeves, and Brenda Lee. And the lineage continues from there. The country pop crossover stars of the 1970s and 80s, like Glenn Campbell, Kenny Rogers, and Ronnie Milsap, and even later smooth country male vocalists like Vince Gill, are all in a way the musical descendants of George Morgan. He helped to create a new lane in country music, one that valued melody, romance, and sophisticated production, a lane that has remained one of the genre's most commercially successful to this day. His ultimate vindication came in 1998, 23 years after his death, when he was finally inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was a long overdue recognition of his importance, a formal acknowledgement that he was not just a one-hit wonder, but a true pioneer. At the induction ceremony, his daughter Lorrie accepted the honor on his behalf, her voice thick with emotion. It was a powerful moment of closure, a final official stamp on his place in history. So, why is the story of George Morgan still relevant? His life is a deeply human lesson about the nature of fame and the meaning of success. He reminds us that commercial success and historical legacy are two very different things. He achieved a level of fame that few artists ever will, yet he is largely absent from the grand mythologized narratives of music history. His story challenges our modern obsession with celebrity as a permanent state, showing us that the spotlight is fickle and that fame, for most, is a temporary loan, not a permanent gift. Furthermore, his life offers a powerful counter-narrative to the live fast, die young trope that dominates so many musical biographies. He was a man who chose family over chaos, professionalism over rebellion, and quiet dignity over dramatic flameout. In an age that often glorifies the tortured artist, George Morgan's story is a quiet but firm testament to the value of a life well lived, even if it doesn't make for a sensational story. He teaches us that a different kind of success exists, the success of being a beloved father, a respected colleague, and a steady, honorable man in a turbulent world. He may be the Candy Kisses voice country forgot, but his story serves as a profound and poignant reminder that the true measure of a life is often found not in the thunderous applause of the crowd, but in the quiet, loving echoes it leaves behind. In the final analysis, the story of George Morgan is a bittersweet ballad, much like the songs he sang. It's a story of a perfect voice arriving at the perfect time, a voice that captured the heart of a nation with its simple, unadorned sweetness. He was the handsome, gentle star who became a cornerstone of the Grand Ole Opry, a man whose life was a testament to the quiet virtues of professionalism, dedication, and above all, love for his family. He was a pioneer who helped guide country music towards a new, polished future, a sound that would dominate the airwaves for decades. And yet his legacy is one of profound irony. The very qualities that made him so beloved in his time, his gentleness, his sincerity, his lack of dangerous edge, are the same qualities that have made him so easy for a history that craves drama and rebellion to overlook. He was a man of quiet grace in a world that would soon belong to the loud, a romantic in an age that was about to embrace cynicism. His story is not one of tragic failure, but of a quiet, dignified eclipse. The light of his fame didn't crash and burn. It was simply overshadowed by newer, brighter, and more explosive stars. but his influence remains a gentle but persistent echo in the smooth delivery of countless country singers who followed, and most vividly in the career of the daughter he adored. He left behind a legacy not of mythic tragedy, but of love. The loss of George Morgan wasn't the loss of a tormented genius, it was the loss of a good Anne. And his story serves as a poignant, powerful reminder that sometimes the most beautiful voices are the ones that sing the quietest, and that the deepest running currents of history are not always the ones that make the most noise. He was the Candy Kid, and his music, for those who take a moment to listen, remains as sweet as ever.